Welcome back to your lesson on rights and freedom. Now, this lesson will follow on from your last lesson on human rights for Indigenous people, and the focus of this lesson will be on civil rights, on the civil rights movement. So, by the end of this lesson, you'll have a better understanding of the US civil rights movement and how it inspired Australia's Indigenous people to fight for their rights and freedom. Now, don't forget, as you're going through this video, to ensure that you take notes and record any questions that you might like to further investigate as part of your learning. Okay, so starting with a little bit of American history. Slavery was practiced throughout the American colonies in the 17th and 18th centuries, and African American slaves helped build the economic foundations of the new nation. Now, on September 22nd, 1862, the then American President Abraham Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation declaring that as of January 1st, 1863, all slaves in the rebellious states shall be then and forever free. Now, the rebellious states being predominantly the southern states of America. Therefore, after the Emancipation Proclamation, while Americans believed in equal opportunity, they didn't actually provide for it. And as a result, up until the 1950s, African Americans faced discrimination in every aspect of their lives. The reality was that rigid segregation was the rule throughout the country as per the Jim Crow laws. Now, the Jim Crow laws mandated racial segregation. So if you were African American, this body of law institutionalized a number of economic, educational, and social disadvantages. It mandated the segregation of public schools, public places, and public transportations, and the segregation of restrooms, restaurants, and drinking fountains for whites and blacks, as you can see on the slide in front of you, which meant that if you were black, you had to use separate entrances to buildings, accesses to separate areas in theatres, buses, and there was white-only housing, jobs, and schools. Also, a vast majority of African Americans were becoming victims of violence and even lynchings. Now, you might think the civil rights movement started with Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, or with Elsa Brown versus the Board of Education, but in reality it started during World War II with the efforts of those like A. Philip Randolph and the soldiers that took part in the D-Day Crusade. But even before that, black Americans had been fighting for their civil rights. It's just that in the 1950s, they actually started to win. So, in the civil rights movement, which took place between 1950s and the 1960s, African Americans led a program of protest against racist policies that denied people their civil rights. Activists used a variety of methods, including court cases, boycotts, marches, and civil disobedience to make their fellow Americans aware of the injustice of denying civil rights to African Americans. For example, on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and got arrested, kicking off the Montgomery bus boycott that lasted almost a year. Basically, as per the Jim Crow laws, if you were African American, you had to move to the back of the bus to give seating to white people. So, the bus boycott brought into prominence Martin Luther King Jr., a young pastor from Atlanta. Now, he helped organize the boycott from his Baptist church, and from here he led a successful 381-day boycott to desegregate buses in Montgomery, Alabama. In the 1960s, his call for civil disobedience using non-violent methods encouraged students in Greensboro, North Carolina, to begin sit-ins in which they maintained continuous occupation of white-only seats in cafeteria. Now, the success of this campaign inspired activists to devise a range of similar methods to desegregate public facilities, and with this, the most famous being the Freedom Rides. Now, as you can see from the slide, it gives you a little bit of a background to what the Freedom Rides was. It actually took place from May through to November 1961, and it was blacks and whites uniting by ignoring the seating rules on buses, but instead sitting together with the aim to overturn seating on buses. So the basically the civil rights movement in America had an influence on Indigenous people in Australia. They found much to support and inspire them in the US civil rights movement. And as a result, civil rights campaigners in Australia liked the non-violent methods of the US civil rights movement. Therefore, from the mid-1960s onwards, they began to have more success in the struggle to achieve the rights and freedoms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Now, this will be dealt with in your next video, in which we'll be looking at civil rights in Australia. See you then. Bye.